What if we could help end a genocide?
The Nobel Peace Prize for 2019 has been awarded to Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed Ali.
Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, winner of the 2019 Nobel Peace Prize, had launched military operations in Tigray in November last year.
On November 4th, 2020, Abiy Ahmed cut off Tigray from the world by shutting down phone, internet, electricity, banks, and basic services. This genocidal war on Tigray is happening in the dark.
We have corroborated information of gross human abuses.
Alleged mass killing of several hundred people.
We are seeing very credible reports of human rights abuses and atrocities.
Abductions and sexual violence against women and girls.
This is part of a campaign that's being intentionally waged against the women in Tigray.
Sexual violence is used by soldiers as a way to fight this war.
Well, it's chaos here.
The Ethiopian Red Cross has warned that 80% of the country's conflict-hit Tigray region is completely cut off from humanitarian aid.
Give us safe and unhindered access. Respect the medical doctors. Respect the health facilities.
Ethiopian troops, along with neighboring Eritrean troops, have killed thousands of civilians, including deliberate weaponized rape of women and girls. Some have called this another Yugoslavia or Rwandan genocide in the making. But today, we hope to change that. Join us in spreading awareness about what's happening in the dark, using hashtag Tigray Genocide and hashtag Free Tigray to pressure the international community to restore peace, provide relief, and ensure accountability in Tigray. 4.5 million people, or 91% of Tigrayans, are on the brink of starvation. But if we band together, we can fight this man-made humanitarian crisis and help ensure a peaceful and thriving Tigray, united as one for the good of helping others. Free Tigray. Helping Tigray is
Good afternoon, and good morning, and good evening to those joining us from the Western and Eastern Hemisphere, respectively. Welcome to the third webinar, a high-level discussion on the genocidal war in Tigray. This is part of 4 webinars being held in November. It's organized to coincide with the first anniversary of the start of the war. My name is Makonnen Tesfaye, a member of the Mahata Tigray UK, an open and all-inclusive campaigning platform for Tigrayans in the UK. The webinars are organized in partnership with the Tigray Youth Network, an association of Tigrayan youth in the UK, who campaign against the war in Tigray and for the rights and self-determination of Tigrayans. Mahata and TYN are part of the global Tigrayan diaspora. I would like to welcome you all and our distinguished panelists who will be making presentation on the topic of the seminar. The speakers will be introduced by the moderators. I would like to welcome and thank Dr. Fiona Meehan and Chezi Baldwin, our moderator of today's seminar. The moderators will introduce the topic, the presenters, and lead the seminar. Dr. Fiona Meehan is a rural development and gender specialist who has been involved in Tigray since the early 1980s, including coordinating an international NGO aid consortium operating cross-border from the Sudan into Tigray, and then working for the TPLF Foreign Relations Department during the 1980s, Ethiopian famine and civil war. After the end of the war in 1991, she worked in Ethiopia for 12 years with the Relief Society of Tigray as special advisor to the executive director and then head of research and policy before returning to Ireland to complete her PhD on smallholder agriculture and female-headed households in Tigray. Fiona has worked since as a lecturer in development studies and as an independent researcher and consultant for organizations including RACE, Irish Aid, UNFAO, and the Tufts University. Chessie is a PhD research student of history at the University of Reading, specializing in women in conflict in the 20th century. She has been published in the UK on female fighters in Tigray during the Liberation War and the legacies of the war for today's crisis, and is currently writing a thesis on Tigrayan women's experience of conflict from 1974 to date. Thank you. I now pass you on to Fiona and Chessie.
Thank you, McConnon, for that, for the introduction, and welcome again to everyone who's linked in for this third one in the series of 4 webinars. Just to recap very briefly, the first one we focused on what was going on in Tigray, what had happened and what was still happening in Western Tigray, and evidence around that, including what was published that week, the report by the UN and the Ethiopian Commission for Human Rights on war crimes in Tigray. We were also focusing on definitions, differences between ethnic cleansing, between genocide, and the responses to what was happening. The second webinar focused on comparative experiences of genocide, including former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. And now for this third one, we're focusing in on really what needs to happen next. The international response to the war crimes in Tigray, how we need to move towards a process of justice and accountability, what the legal and other challenges and opportunities are to move forward to get recognition of genocide as it's happening, as it has happened in Tigray, and to get justice for the victims and to get accountability for the perpetrators. So we have a very distinguished lineup of speakers today. We have 4 main speakers who will all speak for 15 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion and question session after that. So it's quite a tight program, so we'll move along quite fast through it. And I'll move on immediately to introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Evelyn Ohab. She's a human rights advocate, an author, and a co-funder of the Coalition for Genocide Response. Dr. Evelina has worked for years as a fierce advocate for victims of genocide in all parts of the world, including the Uyghur in China, the Rohingya in Myanmar, and groups in Syria and Iraq. So I'll move on to you, Dr. Evelina, and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for that, and thank you very much for organizing this series of important discussions on the situation in Tigray, marking 1 year of the atrocities. And I think you started also with a very important video asking the question that is neglected across many different cases of genocidal atrocities. What if we could help to prevent or stop genocide? And I think this is something that should be really directing our action and should be at the forefront of any kind of responses to such atrocities. In my presentation, I would like to focus on the issue of genocide determination and explain it on the example of the UK and how it works or does not work in the UK. But generally speaking, not many states deal with the issue of genocide determination, even though it is a crucial step to inform the responses to such atrocities. If we look at the recent years and some of the contemporary cases of genocide, not many governments have dealt with the issue of genocide determination in the first place. For example, in the case of the Daesh atrocities, only 3 governments recognized the atrocities as genocide and acted upon. That was in the US back in 2016. The government recognized the atrocities as genocide after its own analysis of the atrocities. Canada recognized the atrocities mid-2016 after the UN Commission of Inquiry on Syria published a report they came to destroy and recognize the atrocities as such. And then the Netherlands, a couple of years later, after the Dutch government obtained a legal opinion from independent experts. So, for example, in the case of the Daesh atrocities, only three governments recognized the atrocities as genocide. Of course, there have been some parliamentary recognitions, but nonetheless, if we look at the states recognizing the atrocities, we had only 3 states doing so. In the case of the recent atrocities against the Uyghurs, there's only one government that recognized the atrocities as genocide, and that's, of course, the US, again, based on its own analysis. But then, for example, if you look at the situation in Myanmar, the US government, despite the fact the US government has been at the forefront of such determinations of genocide, did not recognize the atrocities as genocide until this day. And there have been several civil society communities coming together and calling upon the US government to recognize it as genocide, but this has not been done yet. And because of this failure, the US government is being accused of politicizing such a determination, which is of course also which is negative for other determinations of genocide. If of course the allegation is that the US government is abusing such determinations of genocide for political means. But this is just a very brief information in relation to few of the recent cases of genocidal atrocities, how few governments have been dealing with it. But I would like to specifically focus on the UK government and what the UK government has been doing. The UK has a long-standing position, which is not grounded in law, that such a determination of atrocities as genocide should be done by international judicial bodies. The government repeated this argument and again as Lord Alton was moving the so-called Genocide Amendment to the Trade Bill, which would have equipped the High Court to make a determination of genocide. And central objection by the government was that the determination of genocide should be made by international judicial bodies. In one of its responses, the UK government argued that it would accept as a rightful determination an order made by an international court, such as the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and as it has done, for example, in the judgment of the case of Ratko Mladic, namely a final judgment made by an ad hoc tribunal. And of course, this response poses several problems. The first, the judgment in the case of, for example, Ratko Mladic refers to individual criminal responsibility for genocide in the case of the Bosnian genocide, and not the interim determination of genocide for the purpose of informing a state's responses. Second, waiting for such a judicial determination for over a decade after the genocide has been perpetrated means that the UK would not be able to trigger the duty to prevent under Article 1 of the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And as discussed by the International Court of Justice in the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina versus Serbia and Montenegro, in that judgment, from that judgment, we know exactly that the duty to prevent should be triggered at the very moment a state learns or should have learned of a serious risk of genocide, rather than once the genocide is already happening. Also, if this determination, as according to the UK government, is dependent on an ad hoc tribunal or even International Criminal Court, such determination would not be made in many situations. For example, the case of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang and the Yazidis and Christians in Iraq, and indeed in the case of Ethiopia, could not be considered and determined by international judicial bodies, as currently there is no international tribunal with the jurisdiction to do so. Furthermore, any attempt to refer those situations to the ICC by the UN Security Council could be vetoed by one of the permanent members. We know exactly the risk of that. And the same applies to establishing an ad hoc tribunal, which can be done only by the UN Security Council. And the UK government said little about the option of engaging the International Court of Justice. And indeed, despite leaving the question of genocide determination to international judicial bodies, the UK government does not engage the International Court of Justice, and I'll explain that in a moment as well. The government's response also misses the elephant in the room. The UK and not international judicial bodies are the duty bearers under the Genocide Convention. The UK has a questionable legacy of triggering the duty to prevent genocide when it learns, or should normally have learned, of the existence of a serious risk of genocide. The underlying reason for this is for this failure is that the UK does not conduct its own analysis of the risk factors of genocide in order to determine the situation as posing a risk of genocide. And the UK indeed voluntarily delegates this duty to the international judicial systems. And despite relying on the argument that it's for international judicial bodies to deal with the question of genocide determination, the UK government does not engage, for example, such bodies as the International Court of Justice. For example, in the case of Gambia, in the case of the atrocities against Rohingyas in Myanmar, the Gambia initiated proceedings against Myanmar at the ICJ, alleging that the government of Myanmar was involved in atrocities against the Rohingya Muslims in violation of the Genocide Convention. And a few months later, Canada and the Netherlands supported the initiative. And the UK, however, continues to only monitor the situation. And in a number of written parliamentary questions and letters to the government, Lord Alton, among others, called upon the UK government to officially support the proceedings against Myanmar, but the UK refused to do so and said that they will continue monitoring the situation. So now, what is the story with the alleged genocide in Tigray? Based on what I said, you will correctly guess that the UK would not make a determination of the atrocities as genocide, has never done so, unless and there is some kind of judgment from an international court, whether ad hoc tribunal, whether international criminal court. But unfortunately, of course, at this stage, we don't have such a judgment. So the UK will continue to just revert back to this argument that it's not for politicians, it's for international judicial bodies to make such a determination of genocide. But also the UK government has made no comments in relation to the serious risk of genocide. And again, Lord Alton and a few other parliamentarians have been calling upon the UK government to at least conduct some kind of assessment of the serious risk of genocide. And unfortunately, even in relation to that, we received the same response, that it's not for politicians, but for international judicial bodies to deal with the question of genocide, despite the fact that we ask for something totally different. We ask for the assessment of the serious risk of genocide. And in a number of parliamentary questions, Lord Alden has been chasing the government for a little bit clearer response in relation to the atrocities, but unfortunately, the response has been the same again and again, that the UK government continues to monitor the situation in Ethiopia, is concerned about the situation in Ethiopia, about the human rights violations in Ethiopia, but unfortunately, without moving in the direction of actually assessing the level and severity and nature of the atrocities, and of course acting upon. Because ultimately, once we recognize any kind of atrocities as, for example, genocide, that's not the end. That should be the beginning of action. That should be the trigger point to ensure that we take steps to prevent the materialization of the serious risk and preventing the atrocities from happening. And just going back very quickly to the question that was asked in the video, what if we could help to prevent or stop genocide? In relation to this, we know that the UK government does not have comprehensive monitoring and analysis mechanisms that could help this work. And of course, if the UK government does not have comprehensive monitoring and analysis mechanisms, it means that the government is not able to deal with the first step that needs to be done to monitor the situation, analyze the atrocities, recognize them for what they are, and then act to address them with comprehensive actions, engaging different departments, engaging different actors. But unfortunately, we don't have such a mechanism at this stage, and that prevents any comprehensive response to the situation in Tigray. This all, of course, sounds very, very negative. I just wanted to leave you with one positive message, that of course the UK government promised to review and reform its mechanisms for monitoring and analysis of atrocity crimes, and that was in response to recommendation 7 of the Bishop of Truro review. And the government's pledge is to do so until summer 2022. So there is still some time for the government to do that, but unfortunately, of course, the time passes by. We have only 6-7 months to implement this recommendation. But nonetheless, I would definitely encourage everyone who is listening today to contact your MP, to call upon them to engage the government in relation to this recommendation, and engage the government as a means of also trying to trigger a little bit of action and putting more pressure on the government to actually implement this recommendation. And then, of course, once we have such a comprehensive monitoring and analysis mechanism in place, that's when we can monitor early warning signs, assess the serious risk of genocidal atrocities, and act. But without such a mechanism, unfortunately, the UK government is not equipped to prevent or stop genocide anywhere, whether in Tigray or anyone else. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. That was a really informative and quite sobering, I think, introduction to how the challenges being faced, even in genocide recognition, and that first step of having it recognized before we can move on to any further action. It was really useful taking one country as an example. We'll move on now to Sarah Hunter. She's the Communications and Digital Media Officer for the Global Centre for the Responsibility to Protect, and has conducted a significant level of research on populations at risk of mass atrocities, particularly in the Horn of Africa and the Philippines and Libya. So thank you, Sarah. I'll move on to you now.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Let me at the outset quickly thank the organizers for having me and for hosting this informative and timely seminar series on the conflict in Tigray. I don't think it's news to anyone in attendance today that abuses that have taken place in Tigray and neighboring regions are likely amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. There are many that also believe that these abuses suffered by Tigrayans amount to genocide. These abuses have been second to none in their unimaginable cruelty. I think especially what's been suffered by Tigray's women and girls. I've been asked specifically to speak on why the international community failed to halt these mass atrocity crimes in Tigray, how we can rectify these egregious failures, and what we can learn from them. So I'm going to start with obviously why the international community failed to halt the atrocities in Tigray. And I believe this answer, we could discuss it in depth for quite a long time, but I'm going to focus on the aspects that I personally saw most prominently during the early days of the conflict and in my engagements with states. And namely, these would be the success of the information blackout in shaping the narrative, the lack of political will, and essentially the Ethiopian government being given too much benefit of the doubt. And so first, on the information blackout, in all of the initial conversations that my colleagues and I were having in November and December of 2020 and onwards, the first thing asked by just about everyone, states and NGO colleagues alike, was, do you have any information? Do you know anybody on the ground? Is there anything concrete coming that you can share with us? And the lack of verifiable information coming out of Tigray was a serious impediment to any type of early action on the crisis. States simply would not act and could not act without anything concrete or verified. And when I'm talking about action here, I'm talking specifically about holding, an open Security Council meeting, which we know didn't happen until many, many months into the conflict. That being said, I do want to point out that states had ample information on what was happening, to these, what could have happened and did happen to the Yazidis in Iraq, the Rohingya in Myanmar for many years prior, and still failed to adequately respond to those crises and prevent atrocities from happening. So I can't guarantee there would have been action ahead of time, but this lack of information did not help, especially in the early days. Another symptom of the success of the communications blackout was how it helped shape the narrative among the international community. Many states were almost solely focused on the humanitarian situation, as the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs was the main kind of agency reporting on what they were seeing on the ground, which was basically they couldn't have access and that people were now cut off from aid. And so while we need a robust actions on the Security Council to end atrocities or halt an ongoing conflict, you don't necessarily need that kind of political posturing to ensure aid delivery. And so it's extremely difficult to change those perspectives from looking at the situation as a humanitarian crisis where there's possibly atrocities or possibly, you know, abuses and violations happening behind this conflict line, to know this is an atrocity situation causing the humanitarian crisis, and we need to view it and address it as an atrocity situation. But if you don't have evidence or concrete evidence of those atrocities, it's very difficult to change that perspective. Secondly, I want to talk about the lack of political will here. As many of us know, the political environment in general we're operating in is extremely polarized. The only international body that has power to impose really legally binding measures that could really stop any type of conflict is the UN Security Council. And it's currently completely fractured and paralyzed on just about every issue before it, from the conflicts in Syria and Myanmar and Yemen to thematic issues, even like women, peace, and security. And the crisis in Ethiopia was and is no different. The conflict raged for months before a public Security Council meeting was held. A year on, and we only have 2 press statements that have been passed, and those are, you know, very low level, the lowest basically level that the UN Security Council can respond to a crisis. And those were only passed after, you know, weeks or, you know, a long and extensive period of negotiation. And in this context, not only were states who wanted to act publicly, so that's namely, you know, the US and European states, opposed by Russia and China, but there was vocal opposition from the A3+1, or the African group plus St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And only recently has that perspective started to shift, with kind of Kenya coming out and stepping up pressure both bilaterally and on the Security Council to try to end and address the crisis, I think, in a more substantial way. States were also very wary of pushing the Africa group too far and closing doors and not wanting to exclude and cut off any type of communication for any possible negotiation going forward. And I think the UN more generally has also kind of taken this stance, wanting the AU to be at the forefront of negotiations, wanting it to be, you know, African solutions for African problems. And over this year, I think we're finally seeing now some sort of movement on that front, but it's taken far, far too long to get here. And lastly on this, I think really the Ethiopian government was given too much benefit of the doubt for way too long. For better or for worse, we've all heard this time and time again that Ethiopia has been viewed as this oasis of stability in a conflict-prone region. And early on, states, I think, really wanted to believe what Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed was saying when he promised that, you know, the law enforcement operation would be over very soon. States wanted to believe his repeated assurances of access to humanitarian workers, of restraint, of, you know, promising investigations, until these repeated assurances really became a pattern of inadequate or an inadequate action and just blocking access and doing the opposite of what they were saying they were going to do. And, you know, Abiy at the outset was not Bashar al-Assad of Syria. He's not General Min Aung Hlaing of Myanmar. He was recently a Nobel Peace Prize winner. He's been lauded. He was, you know, before this all happened, he was lauded for seemingly progressive reforms and released thousands of political prisoners and come to power in a wave of popularity. And his relationships were good. And Ethiopia is an important ally for many states in the West and otherwise. And Abiy's supporters are also numerous and vocal. And so it put all of this context kind of put states, I think, on a more wait and see pattern than should have been from the outset. And bilaterally, I think we're still seeing this play out. The US has been vocal, I think, about the crimes committed, even saying it's investigating claims of genocide and ethnic cleansing, but it still stops short of sanctioning parties to the conflict more broadly, instead choosing a much less politically difficult path by sanctioning Abiy's Eritrean allies. I do think this is beginning to shift with a broader sanctions possibilities, given the executive order that was passed that was signed last month, I think it was, and then also the recent sanctions on Eritrea and removing Ethiopia from the AGOA preferential trade agreements. But barring a dramatic change on the ground in the next few weeks, I think we can expect a little bit more forceful action from the US. Now, quickly, I wanted to discuss, you know, why or how we can rectify these failures. And I think the best and really only way to do so is through support. And support should come from in the form of, facilitating a comprehensive ceasefire, facilitating delivery of humanitarian aid, ensuring justice for all victims of atrocities, and including an immense post-conflict reconstructive process. I think there definitely must be support for efforts to end the conflict, no matter what side you're supporting or who you're discussing with. All civilians in the conflict zone and in Tigray continue to be at risk of further atrocities if the fighting does not come to an end. We cannot begin to move forward without a conditionless ceasefire, because neither side will accept the list of conditions set out by the other. The international community should, I think, continue to exert pressure where needed here, mainly in the form, I think, of halting arms flows and economically focused sanctions. I think that's where it can hit the hardest and influence the most, as well as supporting the African Union initiatives to end the violence, as seen as at this point the most progress that we've made in months of conflict. And I think the support can also come in the form of, international or regional ceasefire monitors, or a frontline buffer zone, or any way that parties can kind of be assured of start to build some type of trust between, so we can move forward. The next would be ensuring the unfettered delivery of humanitarian aid. And this is fairly simple. All populations that need aid must receive it, especially the populations experiencing famine-like conditions in northern Ethiopia, mainly in Tigray. The blockade on Tigray must end immediately, and no party to the conflict should be diverting or looting aid. And once this is achieved, the international community must really step up and use diverted funds and open up a kind of an immense, waterfall of aid into the region, because we don't even have an idea of what the situation is on the ground right now. We're still using famine-like condition numbers from June and July. And so we're going to need to address a catastrophic humanitarian crisis as the second that there's aid allowed in. Additionally, I think regional and international support at this point must also come in the establishment of an impartial investigative mechanism, followed by an international accountability mechanism. And I know this form of support will be viewed by the government as an imposition, but given the environment that we're operating in Ethiopia, with hate speech and inflammatory rhetoric and an ongoing conflict, no side will believe justice has been served if perpetrators are involved in enacting that justice. We are in dire need of an international mechanism to fully investigate the extent of what's happened in Tigray from the beginning of the conflict until the conflict ends. And this justice, I think, it has to be international. And if it's, impartially with AU mechanisms and something coming out of the Human Rights Council, whichever way, it has to be international. Because it needs to be impartial and genuine to actually have some type of closure and reconciliatory effect for populations that have been victimized. And lastly, I think we should be supporting a national reconciliation and immense structural reform post-conflict, given that Ethiopia was in dire need of this localized reconciliation before. We're in even more need of this now. And I'm talking neighborhood to neighborhood and town to town conversations on long-standing grievances and complex relationships given between different ethnic groups, and also border areas and intercommunal violence all need to be addressed. Diverse, trustworthy, and transparent institutions must be created to effectively weigh in on these long-standing abuses and long-standing grievances. And there has to be some type of agreed upon process for staffing those mechanisms, whether that's with, parties from both sides, whether that's with international mediators. There has to be some sort of agreed upon process so we can move forward, because right now we're operating in a completely polarized environment. Quickly, I want to just address, the lessons that we can learn and take away from this crisis and the failures of the international community. And sadly, I think many of the lessons that we can learn from Tigray are not new lessons. They're lessons that we've learned before and just failed to act on in this context. But I think I want to point out two things. I think one particular lesson is how we can't allow the prevailing, narrative to silo crisis because it impacts international response. So how I mentioned previously is when we focused on crises in almost a purely humanitarian context, which happened, I think, for far too long in Tigray, we fail in our response. So was the humanitarian situation in Tigray urgent early on in the crisis, as it continues to be today? Absolutely. But would only ensuring unfettered delivery of aid solve this crisis? Not in the slightest. And so the international community must keep its eyes open to the root causes of these humanitarian crises and work just as fervently for a solution when it's actually a political or other type of grievance at the center of it. We must start pouring the same amount of effort and financial resources into preventing atrocities like what happened in Tigray as we do to try to fix them, in hopes that we can actually spare millions of civilians the suffering that we've witnessed over the last year. And now we repeatedly also fail in foreseeing the commission of these atrocity crimes and not acting on the early warning signs from experts in the region or experts in atrocity prevention. And I think we're also continually failing that realizing that atrocities can happen anywhere, even at the hands of Nobel Peace Prize winners. They can happen in established democracies or ones that are making progress in the right direction. They can be committed by our allies and our foes alike, and they need to be addressed similarly, no matter how politically inconvenient. And despite our failures, the international community must continue to make progress in raising the stakes of committing atrocities in hopes that one day what happened in Tigray is a relic of the past. And so I'm going to stop there, but I'm looking forward to the discussion that we're going to be having in a little while. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that. I think that was a really useful overview of the international response, particularly focusing on those three key aspects: the lack of information, the issues around political will particularly, and again, we're seeing the role of the UNSC coming to the fore, as we did in Dr. Evelina's presentation. And there's been a lot of focus, and I think needs to be continuing focus, on why that has significantly failed during this past year. And then the extent to which, and perhaps related to that, the extent to which the international community has given too much credit and perhaps hung on too long to Abiy Ahmed and the Ethiopian government. It would be interesting maybe to get some more comments on to what extent people think this may still be the case in trying to bring about ceasefires, and even in the introduction of sanctions at this point, and how effective those current approaches right now in the context of what's happening may or may not be. So I'll leave it at that and pass on to Chezi now, who's going to introduce the next two speakers, and then I'll come back later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fiona. It's my pleasure now to introduce Mr. Isaias Halimariam. Isaias specialised in international law at Berkeley School of Law in the University of California, and he's currently co-chair of the Governance, Peace, Security Committee of the Global Society of Tigrayan Scholars and Professionals. And he also chairs GSTS North America. Isaias has written numerous articles and reviews on the Ethiopian legal system, and he regularly appears on media and public platforms to comment on the current political turmoil in Ethiopia. And he's also currently working in the private legal sector in California. So we're very keen to hear his opinion around the law, modalities, and procedures of bringing perpetrators to justice in Tigray. So Isaias, please.
Thank you very much for the introduction and the opportunity. Again, I think some of the topics, the issues were raised by the previous speakers, and I think I will try to reinforce on that a little bit. So I think the topic I'll be talking about is the exploring the approach and strategies for criminal investigation, holding perpetrators accountable. So I think the topic we'll be talking about is how to investigate and hold perpetrators accountable. So I think for that, to make the discussion more robust and engaging, I think I will try to separate the topics into three. The first portion would be the evidence gathering, and the second, venue selection, or the place where the atrocity will be prosecuted, and the third, enforcement mechanisms, or it could be a legal or political way. So I think that being said, to hold criminals accountable, the first step would be gathering evidence and data collection, and I think that's the most important element of any criminal investigation and prosecution process. So the reason for that is, first, you have to have evidence. You have to have concrete, acceptable, admissible evidence to hold criminal perpetrators accountable at any tribunal. It could be international or local tribunal. So for that, I think what we need to do is, first, we have to prevent the spoilage of evidence, and we have to digitalize evidence. We have to put every evidence regarding the atrocities in a digitalized and very accessible manner. So the first step will be collection of the evidence and making it very appropriate for future prosecution of this criminal proceeding. And the second topic or the second issue regarding the evidence is we have to identify admissible evidence from relevant evidence. Of course, we have multiple evidence from different directions coming, could be from internet sources, personal witnesses, videos, pictures, you name it. But I think we have to start identifying the evidence that's more admissible in trial. But that doesn't mean that any other evidence is not relevant. Any relevant evidence can also be collected and stored for different purposes, for historical record or any other purpose. So the first and most fundamental step to hold criminals accountable is the evidence collection process. And the second and most important topic I'll be talking about is the identifying the proper venue and tribunal to bring legal action. So when we say this, when I say venue, it means the place where the case will be prosecuted or any legal action to be taken. So in that regard, I will try to separate different jurisdictions or the place where legal action can be taken, possibly. So first would be the domestic or local jurisdiction. So, and I know most of these crimes are international crimes, core crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. So these are international crimes basically based on the Geneva Convention and other international instruments. But there is also there's also local or domestic legal proceeding or legal avenue, because most of these laws are also incorporated in different countries' laws. For example, Ethiopia incorporated and accepted these international criminal provisions, including genocide, in Ethiopia's local criminal law, for example. So the first option could be establishing local human rights commissions and local tribunals. That could be in Ethiopia or maybe at local level, at Tigray level, for example. So it's by establishing these commissions, Tigray can start investigating in a very independent and transparent way, and also bring legal action against these perpetrators through local tribunals that may be established in the future. So the first option in terms of local jurisdiction is establishing domestic tribunals and human rights commission organizations to bring legal action. And I think the second option could be if the current regime is overthrown, I think the transitional arrangement or the transitional government can sign the International Criminal Court ICC jurisdiction, or accept the ICC jurisdiction by signing the Rome Statute, signing and ratifying the Rome Statute and become a member of the ICC. This is possible and it can be done if the transitional government, the would-be transitional government is willing and able to sign this. So by that, Ethiopia will allow the ICC to prosecute and hold these perpetrators accountable. This is the second option in terms of domestic jurisdiction, which means the local option or remedy. And there are pros and cons of this domestic jurisdiction option. First, in terms of the pros or the positives, it's very flexible. You have control, very accessible, and speedy in terms of the proceeding. Most of the international proceedings are very lengthy, takes 10 years, 20 years, even more. So I think using local tribunals, it can be more speedy because you have control, and there's a better enforcement mechanism, even though there are certain limitations to that. And I think in terms of enforcement, better. And I can give an example on this. If some of you remember, in Ethiopia, there was an international genocide tribunal conducted in Ethiopia by Ethiopian courts, Ethiopian prosecutors in Ethiopia. So everything done in Ethiopia. So this is the Derg trial, the Derg regime. The previous socialist government officials were prosecuted under the Ethiopian criminal law, the criminal proceeding and criminal law. The substantive and the procedural laws of Ethiopia were applied to hold the previous regime's officials accountable. The Derg regime, the socialist or communist regime, more than 30 years ago. So this is one of the examples. So it was done there are certain limitations to that. There are issues, in terms of its effectiveness, and but in general, it was possible because the Geneva Convention was ratified and included as Ethiopian law. It was part and parcel of Ethiopian law, and these officials were prosecuted using Ethiopian law. There are cons, or the downside of this local tribunal or local proceeding. First, most of the perpetrators, the main perpetrators, are likely to escape. The main people behind this crime may be, they may escape because they have the money and the connection. So most of them would, avoid prosecution. For example, who knows, Abiy or some of these, prominent generals who committed atrocities may, live in, they may avoid prosecution because they have, again, they have the resource and they may not be held accountable. So I think that's the limitation in terms of local tribunal. And there's no extradition agreement. So for example, if there is a final judgment and prosecution and trial against these perpetrators under the Ethiopian law, or maybe under the Tigrayan local tribunals, there's no extradition agreement with most countries. So for example, Tigray, obviously it's not a country, so it doesn't have any extradition agreement with any country in the world. So if most of these, the prominent criminals, the main criminals, escape Ethiopia, even if there's final judgment against them, criminal prosecution and any sentence, it's impossible to enforce it because most of these people, the prominent, the most the bigger figures will end up somewhere in Europe or in Saudi Arabia or anywhere in the Middle East or somewhere. So I think the lack of extradition agreement, even Ethiopia as a country, doesn't have extradition agreement with most countries in the world. So I think that's the second limitation, or the downside. And legitimacy and credibility is also another concern. So if there is a local tribunal and that local tribunal pass a judgment or any final sentence against these perpetrators, it can face recognition and credibility issue because it's local. Most of these crimes are by nature, they are international crimes and tried under international law. So most countries and the international community may find it difficult to recognize it. So there's it requires political will, obviously. So I think the credibility issue is one of the concerns. And the other concern is we're not talking about just a criminal element. There's also the civil aspect, civil remedies. So it's not just holding the criminals accountable, but there is that civil remedies issue. For example, the compensation, restitution, rehabilitation, and also we have to have the Truth Commission, which means Tigray may require a public apology of the crimes committed, like it was in South Africa, for example. Part of the reconciliation process was that the apartheid regime has to apologize publicly. So all these have to be done, and that's including the civil remedies. And I think enforcing the civil remedies is also difficult if we choose or opt for the local option. For example, let's say there is a judgment against Eritrea by Ethiopian tribunals or Tigray tribunal. So, and obviously Eritrea doesn't have a lot of money, and for example, if the judgment requires that Eritrea to allow Tigray to use the Eritrean port for 100 years, for example, who's going to enforce that? So, because this is local, you don't have an international mechanism, so it can be very difficult to enforce. And I think these are some of the things to be considered. And also, if there's any judgment against Ethiopian corporations, the Ethiopian Airlines, or some of these big companies that operate overseas, there's no enforcement mechanism if we prosecute them by local tribunals, because most of the money, the property, everything is outside. So very difficult to enforce in terms of civil remedy. So I think these are the downsides of the local tribunal. And the second is regional, the regional option, obviously the African Union. So when we talk about African Union, we're talking about the African Commission on Peoples and Human Rights. That's one of the organizations that brings legal action against human rights violations. So again, there are pros and cons of using the local or regional option. The pros would be first, Ethiopia and Eritrea are members of the African Union, obviously. So that means, if there's political will, there could be binding judgment or action against them. But unfortunately, no. I will discuss that in the second topic. So they're members, obviously, under Article 4H of the African Union Constitution or the Constitutive Act. If a member state violates any human rights, or if there's any major or serious human rights violation, the African Union is allowed to intervene and interfere. However, as most of you know, African Union was very silent, turned a blind eye when thousands of Tigrayans have been raped, killed, and there's a mass atrocity going on. Actually, the chairperson of the African Union lives in the capital of Ethiopia. He lives there, a very luxurious apartment, and thousands of Tigrayans are being incarcerated, like right in front of him. So he's not doing anything at all. So don't expect anything from African Union, obviously, and there are many reasons for that, which I'll be discussing. And it sounds accessible. The African Union is local organization. It sounds accessible, but actually, it's very dysfunctional, and obviously. And the cons or the downsides of the original option is first, so most of the African countries and regimes they're all about maintaining and protecting the status quo. So, and there's a reason for that. The African Union, as most of you know, is a post-colonial institution. So it was established right after Africa was, freed from colonialism. So that means, by its nature, it's intended to protect regimes, governments, and regimes. These, strong men. It's not about the people, the African people. It's about regimes and governments. So that means, whenever there is human rights violation, they don't care. They care about the regimes and the system. So, I can give you an example. In Africa, there were a lot of crises. A lot of crises happened in the past. The Libya, Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, Mali, and even Nigeria. So there were mass atrocities happening in Africa for many years, including the Rwanda genocide. The African Union failed multiple times. So, by its nature, the African Union is a failed institution, and I think we don't have to expect a lot. I can discuss, the details and why the African Union is not the, appropriate venue to, hold the perpetrators accountable. Multiple reasons, including personal, conflict of interest. For example, the African Human and People's Rights Commission. The commission is chaired by Dr. Solomon Ayala Dorso. I don't know if some of you know. This person he was a witness when the prime minister decided to postpone the election in Ethiopia. He was asked as expert witness. He's a friend of the prime minister and he supports the regime. So that means if we bring legal action, we're bringing the action in front of the person who'll be, defending the prime minister. So there's personal conflict of interest, as it happened during the so-called joint human rights investigation, the most recent one. The Ethiopian Human Rights Commission is chaired by Dr. Daniel Bakala, and his friend or his, brother-in-law, not just family tie, but also a person who has political motive. One of his family members is Netzanet Balai. He's the chairperson of the East Africa Amnesty International. So I have a very objective reason why there's conflict of interest. So basically, they're interconnected everywhere, and we don't expect independent investigation at this point in time. So, and I think the African Union is the worst option. So I think we have to focus more on the international, obviously. The third and final option to hold the criminals accountable, obviously, is that the international. This is common knowledge. Most of you know this, so I would not dare to lecture, but I'll give you a general idea of the pros and cons of the opting for the last option, the ICC. The pros, obviously, it's more efficient because in terms of human capital, human resource and capital, expertise, and enforcement mechanism, the ICC or the international option is much better. And also, UN Security Council, obviously, I think Sarah discussed it a little bit. So the UN Security Council option, obviously, this unanimity is the concern. So it has to be unanimous. And obviously, China and Russia always, they're on the opposite side or aisle, and that could be resolved sometime soon, I guess, because China and Russia, they flip. So China and Russia support of the Ethiopian regime, it's not based on principle. It's just about strategic alliance. So in the past, China was a good, it's a communist, communist country. Obviously, was a strong supporter of the previous regime, the Derg regime in Ethiopia 30 years ago. After that regime fell down, or the regime removed, it became a good friend of the APRDF, the previous regime in Ethiopia. So that means whenever there is regime, the China, they become friends with that regime. So I think if the current government is removed, China and Russia will flip. And obviously, during the Security Council voting, probably they may support the soon-to-be regime government in Ethiopia. So I hope the UN Security Council unanimity will be resolved if the current government is removed. The cons of the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, obviously jurisdiction. So Ethiopia did not sign or ratify the Rome Statute. And obviously the UN Security Council is it's a political union. It's not a country, so that means it requires a strong political will. So, and that's the most difficult part of the ICC enforcement mechanisms. And I think it's lengthy. The process, very long process. It takes years, and I think focus on the main perpetrators. So it doesn't prosecute, most criminals or suspects. Only focus the most, prominent figures. So, for example, at a particular year, I think, like in the past 20 years, I think they prosecuted about 12 people, I guess. So, they don't prosecute a lot of people, and that's the other concern. And sometimes lack of enforcement mechanism, because the ICC doesn't have police. They don't have police. They don't have any executive mechanism. So they rely on, other countries' political will to enforce them. So, there's no centralized enforcement mechanism, and that's the issue. And I think there's also criticism of the ICC focus on Africa only. So there are many people complain that ICC focused on Africa only. In the Middle East, a lot of things happen, but there's no in ICC. You don't see ICC in the Middle East. So I think that's also the credibility and the concern. And when we talk about the international option, the third option, there's one overlooked option, which is the universal jurisdiction option. The universal jurisdiction is this principle. You can prosecute criminals wherever they are. Doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be committed in the UK or Germany. As far as a group commits a crime, which is considered a crime against humanity, so you can prosecute. Currently, there are about 12 countries that have, they acceded or accepted the universal jurisdiction principle, including Belgium, Germany, France, UK, Australia, Canada, Denmark, Finland, Senegal from Africa, Spain, Switzerland, and USA. So these 12 countries have the universal jurisdiction option, which means you can prosecute, you can bring legal action in those countries. So originally, this universal jurisdiction principle was meant to prosecute sea pirates and slave traders, because these criminals are stateless, most of them, and they're found at high seas in the middle of nowhere, the ocean. So that means, and sometimes that no man's land. So it's become difficult to prosecute them, because you don't know what citizen they are, and the place where they're captured, high sea, or the middle of the ocean, it doesn't belong to any country, so it becomes difficult. So the universal jurisdiction principle is adopted, and within that, in some of these countries, prosecuted people who committed genocide and crimes against humanity. And that's the second option. And the good thing about this is that it narrows down impunity. The gap in terms of impunity is narrowed. You can use that option, because ICC is very difficult and complicated. And there's also extradition efforts. So in case of Chad, for example, the dictator of Chad was, Senegal tried to extradite him. And the Peruvian president, the former president, Alberto, was also, I think they tried to extradite him from Chile. So, better option, the universal jurisdiction. And there are downsides to that also. Obviously, it requires political will. So political will, because most of the countries that I mentioned earlier are in Europe. And because, for example, Belgium. In Belgium, using universal jurisdiction, you cannot prosecute the prime minister. You cannot prosecute the presidents, like the top officials. And there's a reason for that. Obviously, Belgium is the center of Europe, obviously, and if top officials are prosecuted, it becomes difficult for them to travel to any international meeting, and they're in a political relationship, diplomacy, it affects a lot of things. So Belgium, they exempted, they're exempted. So top officials. So Abiy cannot be prosecuted in Belgium, unfortunately. So that's the the downside. But some other universal jurisdictions allow to prosecute even prime minister. So I'm not saying in general, but like some universal jurisdiction countries don't allow you to prosecute top officials, and that's the downside of universal jurisdiction. And I think these are the main issues. My conclusion is that I think we need more advocacy in terms of legislative advocacy, reaching out to your elected officials, lawmakers, and also political advocacy is the most important thing to do, I think. Human rights it's a universal, and I think this issue should not just be a Tigrayan issue. It has to be a global issue, I think, because human rights are universal, obviously. And I think when we do advocacy, legislative advocacy, political advocacy, I think we have to have like other people also be voices. So it's not, we have to limit the advocacy process, the Tigray's protesting or town hall or tweeting. So I think other people have also, that should also advocate for us. I think we have to push for that. And I think people in universal jurisdiction countries, those 12 countries, Tigrayans and friends of Tigray, I think should, collaborate and try to hold these perpetrators accountable criminally, or civilly, civil remedy as well. I think these are the main issues, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was a really clear explanation of the mechanisms that could be used. And I think that was really useful for most of us who wouldn't have that understanding of how those can work together. And I think it would be useful at some point, maybe later in the discussion, to explore maybe how a hybrid option of international responses and local responses could be used. But thank you for explaining so clearly. And I think really important there that you raised that dichotomy between the civil and the criminal that needs to be taken into account in these instances. So thank you very much for that. But I will hand over now to our fourth and final speaker in this webinar, which is Mr. Bereket Kiros. Bereket holds a degree in liberal arts and a master's degree in business administration from the University of Phoenix. He is chair and co-founder of the Coalition of Immigrants, Refugees and Communities of Colour, and serves as liaison on race and social justice. And as a political activist, he advocates to build racial equality into formal policies and represents the CIRCC in building a movement to restore an inclusive pro-voter system in a state. Bereket advises on priorities, policies and strategies related to equitable civil engagement and public participation in decision-making processes. So Ms. Bereket, over to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate Makate Tigray for having me here. And this is a very important subject that many of us are looking to get solution into it. I'm going to focus on what is genocide and the recognition, pronouncement, and holding perpetrators account, and also the role of Tigray. I'm going to use the word Tigray, Greece version in plural. In many cases, people try to talk about Tigrayans. I think it's appropriate to correct and take a look at the general plural meaning of Tigray, and also how is benchmark and coalition building effort among diaspora, and also the conclusion. And I'm not going to talk about the international criminal and the Article United Convention and the Rome status is already talked about. What I am interested in is, as many of the panelists, genocide is really a very strong term, and many people many countries don't want to be associated to it. For me, genocide is a process, not an event, because it's not something. When I say a process, it reminds me some of the steps that lead us to genocide, looking at Darfur, Bosnia, And also what's happening in Ethiopia. When we say process, it is an act would I see in Ethiopia to preserve Abiy Ahmed legacy by any means necessary, and also weaponizing as an identity, and also the current arming civilians, what's going on. And those are the things that really bothers me as an Tigrayan. In the previous time, Dr. Lakishi and others have spoke in a great tone. For me, pronouncement of genocide recognition is a political, not purely a human rights issue, despite the United Nations preamble on the Declaration of Human Rights. And the nation must consider various calculations, including geopolitical liability, compensation, and reconciliation. The world is divided ideologically, and alliances which has made achieving conscious on equity and justice, particularly on the poor countries, is increasingly difficult, as we see it in the case of Ethiopia. The definition thus underscores three constituent elements of genocide as defined in the Genocide Convention. A protected group defined in cultural terms. In the case, a nation intend to destroy the protected groups in whole or in part, and acts process constitute genocide, namely physical destruction and forcible deportation and destruction of culture and political institutions that we have seen whole year in Tigray. On the other hand, demand of recognition of genocide can create friction in diplomatic relation and consequently become a contested political issue in geopolitical power relation, especially when made towards a foreign state. They can also question of liability if the foreign state in question has conducted armed deals with perpetrating actor. For instance, the Turks and the Chinese, the Russians, Ukraine, Arab Emirates, and Israel company has supplied chemicals, drones, and weapons that enables the Ethiopian and the Eritrean forces to pursue genocide assault on the people of Tigray, as we have seen throughout, which raises a serious liability on the states mentioned, as I see it. Well, the so-called law enforcement, when we see campaign in Tigray, which killed more than 150,000 people, rape thousands, and destroy 100 villages on the ground, and forced over 80,000 people displacement from their homes, food, rape, used as a weapon of war. And it's linked to state and military policy, as we have seen it throughout the year. Ethiopia, Eritrean, Amhara Special Forces, and allied militia committed a serious abuse and violation of human rights. And there are reasonable grounds to believe that a number of those violations may account to a crime against humanity and war crimes. The nature and scale and organization of the operations suggested a pre-planning and a design by the Eritrean leadership for 3 years that may amount to the gravest crime under international law. There are also patterns of atrocities that exemplifies ethnic cleansing. Survivor described soldiers firing indiscriminately into houses and fields, people locked inside their house and set fire, villagers as they tried to flee, mass rape. There are those reasonable grounds to believe that the Ethiopian, Eritrean, and Amhara militia has perpetuated war crime against humanity and possibly genocide against the Tigray people. And this has been confirmed by those people who fled to Sudan. The recognition of the genocide in Tigray is highly complex and political sensitive here in the US, and I hope in some areas of European as well, because where large Ethiopian diaspora resides, or natural citizens, or permanent residents, and non-documented immigrants, because of the perceived consequences from historical perspective. From historical perspective, recognition by the international community could be used towards the demands of earned protect sovereignty in the future. The diaspora as a non-state entity provides a significant extension to the lobbying or advocacy practice in the international area and contributes to make more direct claims for recognition. Well, when I talk about the premises are the central to the question of Genocide Tigray initiative, I see first the idea of the recognition of genocide can serve effective strategy for advancing Tigray's national demands inside Ethiopia and internationally by lending more weight and sense of urgency to the demands of maintaining the enhancing of Tigray self-determination in the future. On the second level, the recognition of Genocide Tigray initiative is the idea that through centering national conscience among Tigray in 21st century of genocide, the collective memory of genocide can become a mechanism for strengthening the Tigray national identity. The commemoration of 365, it has been in Europe and it was also in DC 3 weeks ago of the Tigray genocide helps maintain, even strengthen a sense of national identity. So how do we hold perpetrators accountable? Well, in the work of November trials, following the World War II, the crime of genocide was specifically defined in Article 1 as a murder committed with intent to destroy in whole or part national, ethnic, and religious groups. So the question is, those framed charges of evidence of genocide can be presented as the International Criminal Court. How should be the legal humanitarian issue be addressed? Who is responsible? What are the steps of those process? The global advocacy group that I am part of, the Tigray Global Advocacy, that I am part of this organization, we already submitted our complaint to the ICC twice, but we haven't gotten any response except, sometimes they don't respond to, organizations, but they respond that they are not able to carry such. The Security Council did not recommend that the Security Council refer the situation to the ICC in case of Tigray. Why? They could have created an ad hoc international criminal tribune and the General Assembly, if one writes, could have established a mechanism to collect, preserve, and analyze evidence and to prepare files for criminal proceeding. Tigray and diaspora must press for urgent steps to ensure investigation into human rights violations and abuses are considered. Well, CNN, international media outlets, and independent journalists on Tigray found that there were reasonable grounds to believe that the Eritrean, Ethiopian, and the Amhara militia have perpetuated war crime against humanity, and possible genocide against Tigray people. The Security Council, I believe, 10 times were in session. They should have recommended that the Security Council refer the situation to the International Criminal Court. But they did not happen due to the politics of the Security Council, that the recommendation is unlikely to be acted upon because of the Chinese and Russians veto powers. Ethiopia has been a country of concern for the UN and for the United Nations and the European over a year, with resolution undermining its human rights situation, which was preceded by years of widespread and systematic human rights violation, only concern and lip service. We should bring the genocide recognition initiative to the front that ensures maximum visibility for claims concerning massacres that had taken in Maikadra, as you know, in Aksum, Mariam Dingalat, and Edaga Arbi, and many more places. It is a matter of international law and human rights, and we should continue to advocate for issues like this in every opportunity we can get. Well, what I am interested here is, what is the role of Tigray in diaspora? What is our role in the light of this? Well, as a Tigray in diaspora organization, we must appeal to governments as well as supranational institutions such as United Nations, European Union, and have the Tigray Genocide campaign recognized. Furthermore, diaspora active lobbying or advocacy effort can provide opportunity to take part, increase strategic activism. Tigrayans in the diaspora have mobilized with some success, I will say, in a different host countries to lobby or advocate for the Tigray genocide. For instance, the lobbying of the Armenian government as an example, and intense mobilization with the diaspora had kept the issue of recognition as a front in parliament agendas in Europe countries and United States and elsewhere. And we can use that as a benchmark. This visible, for instance, is a case of Armenian genocide, which has become a highly politicized issue. It has been widely recognized internationally, partially due to the Armenian diaspora lobbying and advocacy efforts. Well, diaspora organizations like us also play a role in the process of pushing those claims further. Nevertheless, it can be said that the genocide recognition efforts have been internationalized due to active diaspora advocacy. In addition, many studies zeroes in on the internationalization of the genocide recognition claim via diaspora lobbying and advocacy on behalf of the motherland, like ours in Tigray. Nevertheless, recognition claims became instrumental for session so long as the political circumstance in the region becomes favorable, as a case of towards Tigray independence. How do we, on this occasion, building coalition in diaspora? Because we can't do it alone. There are countries many like Darfur, Cambodia, Bosnia, Armenia. What do we learn from them? How are we going to build a coalition? Well, building coalition for recognition of genocide requires three important factors. One, a common adversary, a host land context conducive to human rights and transitional justice claims, and speak issue to focus on from abroad. Coalition based on a common experience of victimized and identity can elicit long-term cooperation and high-level involvement. Thus, based on the strategic of interest to pursue a shared adversary with a common victimhood experience and identity. Coalition building between diaspora groups is central contribution here. I have researched mobilization of the Armenian, Assyrians, and Kurdish diaspora for genocide recognition from the perspective of relation between them. Those diaspora have a different history with some have interesting current agendas as well. Coalition building is only one form of diaspora group seeking to build awareness with other groups about human rights violation and genocide as never again experienced. In case 2016-18, such solidarity was shown in diaspora circuit in response of the chemical, as you guys know or aware, the chemical gas attack against civilians in the war in Syria and ethnic cleansing of Rohingya in Myanmar. And the Jewish diaspora, because of the Holocaust, has been looked into this respect and sought by other diaspora. Bosnian, Palestinian, Rwanda, and Tamils have made such a humanist claim in solidarity with others, and we can do as well. While the durable alliance between Armenia and Syria primarily based on the demands of genocide recognition between Armenia and Kurdish, the alliance further related Kurdish population, Armenians, genocide common experience in more recent violence in Turkey and fear of further killing. The desire of Iraq and Kurds to have the Anfa massacre recognized as genocide is a persistent verbal gesture more than a movement. In conclusion, a genocide recognition is incredibly difficult to achieve. I understand that. Such coalition building has been more successful among agents with common identity and common victim-based past, leading to some successful genocide recognition in Western countries and international institutions, especially around 2015 Armenian Genocide Sentinel. Armenians developed diaspora long-term coalition with Kurds to pressure Turkey and we should do the same thing as well. We must urge on our respective countries to recognize genocide against the people of Tigray and to encourage the EU, UN to do likewise. This will enable Tigrayans, many in the diaspora, to achieve justice for our considerable loss. It will be also enable US, Europe, and home of democracy and freedom to send a message of support international convention and human rights. As a preceding goal, it is relatively safe to assume that Tigray Genocide Recognition Initiative is here to stay. Victimhood remains a powerful source of national pride and an important marker of identity, as the realization of Armenian and Ukrainian Genocide Recognition Initiative suggests. However, it's also relatively safe to assume that obtaining wide recognition is going to be difficult, politically controversial, and will likely to result in a meaningful redress to the Tigrayans. But the fight must go on, and I will accept if there is questions. And this is what I thought. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for exploring how lobbying and advocacy and diplomacy within the diaspora can tackle these political challenges of genocide recognition. And I think you made it really important and clear when you talked about how politics and human rights really intersect in these instances. So thank you for that presentation. And I will now hand back over to Fiona to introduce our esteemed discussants, and I look forward to continuing this discussion with you all a little later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So those are the four main speakers that we have on the webinar, and just as a quick recap maybe of the main issues and points that were raised and discussed by all of them. Dr. Evelina focused on the example of the UK, addressing the issue of genocide determination, and was particularly interesting in terms of the political dimensions on that, the extent to which the UK's insistence that genocide can only be recognized by international institutions and not by individual governments has held back, it holds back the ability to trigger the right to protect. It holds back the recognition of genocide. It holds back action on it, and where the initial recognition is key to taking any further action, obviously, in terms of accountability and justice for the victims of genocide. So where the international institutions are seen as the main determinant of whether genocide has taken place or not, it also is tricky in terms of the politics. Referrals to the ICC would be the key route for that. But again, this can be vetoed. And time and again, we're coming to the role of the UNSC and the what you might call intrinsic differences or conflicts of interest within the UNSC, and the extent to which this has blocked any consensus on determinations of even ethnic cleansing, let alone genocide, in relation to what has happened in Tigray. Sarah Hunter then gave us a really good overview of key aspects of the international response, focusing on the difficulties with the information blackout, which was a very, very potent weapon exercised by the Ethiopian government in terms of blocking information of what was happening in Tigray from reaching the outside world. The second aspect was the issue of the political will and understanding within the international community, even when they did know what was taking place, in terms of addressing this. And another aspect was the extent to which too much benefit of doubt, if you like, was given to the Ethiopian government, and the assumptions that they could be talked around, that they could be brought down, that they would basically respond to international calls to desist. But as we all know, that never actually happened. It was also very useful. We also looked at, Sarah spoke about what needed to happen in terms of moving forward. And in that respect, we were looking at a focus on the AU, or why that took so long. That took an extremely long time to take any action, although that's been happening now to some extent. And in terms of what needs to happen to rectify the existing situation or moving forward, was facilitation of the ceasefire, an end to the conflict, the military conflict, and insistence on humanitarian access to all areas that need it. Support for reconstruction of Tigray in terms of all the damage done. Continuing international pressure, including sanctions and stopping of arms flows, and perhaps the presence of international monitors to maintain peace. And then looking ahead to the importance of an internationally independent body or measures to investigate what actually happened in Tigray and elsewhere, and the need for looking ahead, looking at reconciliation process. And then we've had Isaias, beg your pardon, Haile Mariam, looked at how the actual process as it might be moved forward in terms of justice, in terms of bringing perpetrators to account, and the different possibilities were. The key aspects around that were, one, the evidence to be gathered. Two was the venue, where and how did you actually take action on that? And then third, the issues of enforcement. There was a useful, I think, focus in terms of preserving the evidence and looking at that evidence from right now, and making a useful distinction between the importance of maintaining and gathering all the evidence and data of what's happened and keeping it for historical purposes, but separating out evidence that can be seen as admissible and that can be used directly as part of the process of getting recognition. In issues of where and how, different options were discussed. One is the possibility of setting up tribunals or war crime trials in Ethiopia, or indeed even Tigray, on a local level, and we referred back to the process that was followed with the war crimes trials, which took place in Ethiopia after the Derg was overthrown back in the early 1990s. Another possibility was that with the change of government in the Addis Ababa, a new transitional government might look at the possibility of signing up to the ICC, and this would help them to refer war crimes trials to the ICC. The third one is directly to, the second one then is Eritrea and Ethiopia as members of the African Union, and what role the African Union might help in bringing perpetrators to justice. And the third one is the ICC linked in with referrals from the UN Security Council. And this again is where the issues of differences have held this back so far. But I think there was an astute point made that China and Russia have blocked a lot of the consensus in the Security Council to date. But that may not necessarily continue following a change of government in Ethiopia. Both these countries have been very pragmatic in pursuing their own interests, and there is no reason not to assume that they may well be more amenable to those referrals after a change. And then our last speaker, Barakat Kiros, has focused on the role of the diaspora, particularly and the role that they have played to date, and the role that they can play, and using the example of the recognition of the Armenian massacre, the Armenian genocide, and the role that the Armenian diaspora have played over a long period of years in bringing that recognition about, and the extent to which the Tigrayan diaspora can do the same, and the focus in that respect on coalition building and on awareness raising and on advocacy for moving into the future. I'm going to move on now to, that's a very brief recap, to our discussants, who will be going back over some of this and adding their own expertise and their own understanding to the issues as they've been discussed by the four speakers. The first one probably needs very little introduction to people signing in. Professor Mukesh Kapila has been involved in most of these webinars. He's Professor Emeritus of Global Health and Humanitarian Affairs at the University of Manchester, and he's also a Senior Advisor to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Mediterranean. His years of service, his CV would take the full 5 minutes to go through. So I'll simply highlight the fact that he has extensive experience in global health, humanitarian affairs, and conflict and security and international development. And he has played a key role, senior leadership functions and as advisor to a range of governments and international institutions, and is very well known over past years, particularly in relation to his strong sense of principle and integrity with which he's addressed a wide range of international issues and been an advocate throughout his career. So I'll pass on to you, Professor Kapila, for some comments on the issues that we've been focusing on during the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and it's been illuminating to listen to our different expert speakers, and also it's also been hugely clarifying and liberating. It's liberating because if anyone had any doubt before or had any hope before, then put that aside. There are no legal solutions to the genocide in Tigray. And if by the time any legal solutions come along, many, many more people will be dead. So this kind of conclusion would only be of great satisfaction to lawyers and historians, and of course, as I come from the medical profession, to pathologists who will be exhuming the bodies and studying how they died and deducing from that all sorts of things. So I say this is very liberating because too often we are thinking that the international community will come and rescue Tigray. Too often we are thinking that decent countries like the UK or others would come and save us all or save the people of Tigray. Well, of course, any of us who's ever been in international affairs for a long time knows that that was a vain hope, but it was something to clutch on to. So let this seminar not finish before people getting a realistic appreciation that it ain't going to happen. Because international geopolitics is not going to change. I mean, it's good to know, by the way, that China has no principles. You called it diplomatically, it is pragmatic. What I call it, it has no principles. It'll support anyone according to whatever is the interest of the Chinese state. That, of course, is good news, which means that once Tigray becomes independent, and I'll come to that, then you will find that China would like to be good friends with Tigray also. So, but it's extremely important for Tigrayans to realize, don't waste too much time seeking solutions which are not going to come from the international community. Stop talking about the responsibility to protect a norm that has largely failed over past decades. Norms are useful, but norms haven't solved anything. R2P hasn't actually protected anyone, if you like. It has very often led people down false hopes and false delusions. Don't rely on the Human Rights Council. We know what happened with the recent joint inquiry. And the Human Rights Council has no executive powers. It cannot refer anybody to anything. It can simply say terrible things have happened. Only the Security Council had the power to refer states to the International Criminal Court or members or states parties, if you like. And this is what happened in my case when I was the UN head in Sudan. It was the Security Council that referred the matter to the ICC that led to all sorts of processes. Nothing else, in a way. But that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen in the foreseeable future. I think when it comes to advocacy needs to have a focus. Advocacy needs to have an objective. And humanitarian objectives are necessary but not sufficient. Advocates must also remember that there is no peace without justice, as you're finding with the unraveling of Sudan, because the process of justice is incomplete. The process of moving on is also incomplete. So where are we leading? Where does all this lead on to? What it leads on to is that if we recognize that, and finally one other comment, because the word politics was mentioned a lot of time and people were a little bit apologetic. Some of the speakers are a little bit apologetic. Oh, the Americans have politicized this because they recognize this and didn't recognize the other. Well, genocide is a political act. You know, when genocide is a state act, and when states decide to commit genocide, they are making a political decision. There's nothing wrong then that advocacy in and around genocide to prevent it, etc., if ever it was possible to do it, should be highly politicized. Now, Armenians have learned that very well, and others have also learned that, those who actually made progress in this particular area. So I'm all in favor of politics. In fact, more politics the better. I think, in my view, there are two important things. If our purpose in any discussion around genocide is actually to mitigate its consequences, and we recognize all the things we've discussed just now, and that is the prospects are not good in terms of legal or institutional solutions, then it leaves us with only one alternative, and that is to change the politics by changing the facts on the ground. And if you look at the history of genocide, it's always happened that way. In the end, it is only when one side won, when the facts change on the ground. Even in Ethiopia, why did the Ethiopian legal system prosecute the Derg? Because actually they were overthrown. They changed the facts on the ground. And the same thing happened in the Holocaust, same thing happened in Cambodia, and something happened in every single genocide you can think of. Only solution to this then is actually that the defenders of the people of Tigray win their battle and ensure that they establish a space where Tigray can be safe, where Tigrayans can be safe, and that then that safe space begins to have some status of international recognition. And if, for example, we have an independent Tigray, it's not for me to decide or to promote it. If the people of Tigray and different states of Ethiopia have the right to self-determination, if they decide they want to be an independent state, then of course it's open for them to be able to both refer the matter to the ICC by becoming a party to the Rome statutes, as well as take other legal measures as part of their restitution and process of moving on politically. That's, I would think, is the best solution if we're trying to minimize the consequences. My other thing is, and there I think Evelina might have something to say, perhaps more. I mean, I was struck, Evelina, it was one of your initiatives where you had these hearings that took place in the UK when various lawyers got together and they opened independent hearings. I think it was in relation to the Uyghurs. Why can we not get enough responsible, renowned legal personalities, judges, former judges, lawyers, and constitute an independent commission to establish the facts of Tigray and to make a determination as to whether or not those facts amount to genocide. Of course, it doesn't have the backing of the Security Council, and it is more symbolic than anything else. But the very act of doing that is actually provides a focus for the collection of the data and what is admissible and what is not admissible. And by having all the trappings of a proper court, with lawyers, judges, defendants, and judges, and some lawyers defending the genociders, and so on and so forth, what you would do is you would focus attention on the facts and collect the facts. And also it would be a trial run for any future proper legal case that might be brought before any further, any jurisdiction, if you like to see. So I said, and we have independent commissions for many things. We have independent commissions who tell us about climate change. Of course, that is now recognized by the UN. And many, many things have started in the past on that basis, if you like. And then in time, they have created institutions and norms that have been recognized by competent authorities. So my suggestion to you is get some lawyers, judges, renowned international personalities of an independent nature and establish such an independent commission. Doesn't matter whether it has legal status in the eyes of the ICC or the Security Council or not, irrelevant, because anyway, those guys are not going to listen under the current geopolitics, and get the show on the road. And let those who are saying, oh, we must preserve the evidence, we must distinguish the evidence between that which is contextual evidence and that which can actually be used to try at an individual, if you like. Well, get them to put the theory into practice. So it's very easy to do that. So I would suggest some practical, concrete thing like that should be done. Finally, there's one thing I would disagree on in what has been said, that which I think was one of the speakers who said, oh, well, the reason the world didn't act or couldn't act was because there was an information blackout. Rubbish. Sorry, I didn't mean to call the speaker rubbish. I mean, that is total rubbish. One thing that struck me is how much we have come to know about what's going on around Tigray. It's extraordinary, despite the censorship in Addis, despite the difficulties faced by journalists, despite the difficulties faced by communicators of all sorts. We are overrun with testimony, and we are also overrun with validation tools to verify that testimony. So don't give us that excuse that, oh, the world is slow, or the world didn't know because somehow the information was not coming out. That is actually not true. We managed to get out a lot of information. We have received a lot. And the fact that Tigray may not is present everywhere in the world, even if people can't do anything about it for reasons we just discussed, doesn't mean that people don't know about it. So no, information is not the problem, and there's much more out there. So that's all I want to say, that we need to move on. We need to move on. This net sum zero, mutually frustrating arguments. Oh, well, international community is paralyzed. Oh, well, countries won't act. And therefore, and without recognizing genocide, we can't do anything. I think a lot can be done to, one, change facts on the ground. Let's make sure there's a military victory to stop the genocide, which is the first responsibility of any human being that cares for the consequences of genocide. And the second thing is, when you change facts on the ground, then the global politics changes, then everything is possible.
Thank you very, very much for that. It was a very realistic and somewhat depressing overview of the situation in terms of international response and the legal system. And I think you're right. But I think if you look at events on the ground at the moment in Ethiopia, it's very, very clear that people in Tigray recognized at a very early stage that they were not going to be recognized by the international community. And what they're effectively doing is taking matters into their own hands and doing what they need to do to keep Tigray safe. I think it's also worth mentioning in relation, it's true, there was more of a consensus internationally around the humanitarian and the focus on that than there was around the other, but perhaps less of a recognition that the scale of the humanitarian needs were a direct result of the failure to intervene and do anything about the events on the ground that created those humanitarian needs in the first place. So in responding to those, they are dealing with their own failure. And I think that I would really like to focus more on, but perhaps we don't have time right now, but certainly the whole idea of the International Commission and the aspect around that you brought are really, really important for follow-up, if not during this webinar, but certainly at a later stage.
If you give me 10 seconds, I would say,
sure.
The reason this is important is because it is a international court of public opinion that matters. Look at Armenia. The point is, I mean, of course, Armenia, it never got recognized, except now in one or two countries they say it is. But the way that Armenians have used the court of international public opinion has to change the politics around forever. So the real legacy of this is not whether or not we recognize what happened last year as genocide and whether it saves anyone, but whether in the long-term struggle in the court of international public opinion, the people of Tigray win or lose. And that's why my international commission idea might be useful. Sorry to take the floor again.
No, I think it's a very important point. And I'm very happy you've made that point. I am going to move on now to our next discussant, Miyaza Ide, who again, I think needs very little introduction to anybody signed in for this. Miyaza is an international relations specialist and community organizer, and has for the past year particularly been perhaps one of the strongest diaspora advocates and activists in relation to what's happening with Tigray and standing up for Tigray, international media, international fora, writing, researching, and advocating endlessly and ceaselessly and tirelessly for justice for Tigray. So Miyaza, what are your thoughts or comments on what's been discussed so far?
Thank you so much, Dr. Fiona, and everyone for organizing this much needed series of panel discussions. I personally don't have much to add because Professor Kapil has already articulated almost everything I wanted to say. But I think it's very important to highlight that the reason why the international community is not moving towards imposing a concerted effort towards stopping the genocide is due to lack of political commitment. That's just the main reason, and I believe the only reason. I don't think there is lack of information. I don't think the international community doesn't know what's happening on the ground. As a matter of fact, I personally believe that the international community knows more than the Tigrayan community does. And because the evidence is just there, not because the Ethiopian government has done so little to hide their genocidal intention of this war. They have been very brutally honest with regards their intentions of exterminating the people of Tigray whenever they spoke to foreign dignitaries, including the European Union's envoy to Ethiopia. At the same time, the war criminals or the invading forces that were committing all sorts of crime against the people of Tigray, particularly the women of Tigray, they were telling them why they were doing certain acts. For example, we have learned from the very brutal and harrowing testimonies of survivors of the weaponized rape that when members of the Ethiopian National Army as well as the Amhara Fano, when they were raping them, they were telling them that they were doing it in order to cleanse their bloodline, in order to take away their Tigrayan identity and in a way dry the Tigrayan womb from reproducing. So the intention is out there, the evidences are out there. What is lacking is a political commitment. And I believe this lack of political commitment comes from, one, the very unreasonable belief that Abiy is somehow redeemable, that Abiy deserves a chance to maybe continue Ethiopia as a country, but at the same time to continue on the quote-unquote reformist paths he embarked once he took office. And I believe this comes from the very fact that the international community doesn't really understand Ethiopia and Abiy Ahmed's administration. Myself and my friends, most of the time we say blessed are those who do not speak or understand Amharic, primarily because the very condescending nature of the Ethiopian administration, the Abiy Ahmed's administration, is manifested in the Amharic language. And when you do translation, most of the time you tend to lose the comprehensive meaning of these policies and the actions that are being taken. And because of this gap of information, perhaps the international community has a miscalculated political perception of Abiy Ahmed and his administration. And for example, one of the things Abiy Ahmed was praised for is bringing gender parity at the prime minister's cabinet. At the beginning, there were around 50% of members of his cabinet were female, but it literally took only a month or two to reshuffle everybody and to reduce that number of female members of the cabinet to 31%. But there is no follow-up. The international community still praised Abiy Ahmed for bringing gender parity at the parliament. So the international community altogether is giving a blind eye to the Tigray genocide, primarily because they don't have the political commitment and will to hold Abiy Ahmed and his administration accountable. But at the same time, I want to highlight how this is it's not a war between Ethiopia and Tigray, or as Abiy Ahmed would like the world to know, to believe that a war between the Ethiopian state and TPLF. I personally believe that this is a project that has been in the works for years and years, led by strong Amhara nationalists, including Birhanu Nagga, Andargacho Tsige, and others. This is primarily to exterminate the people of Tigray and bring about a strong and unified Amhara or a unionist or an Abyssinian state in the country. And what better way of doing it other than exterminating the only strongest federalist force in the country? So the political miscalculation added with the lack of political commitment from the international community is sustaining the Tigray genocide. And I too, like Professor Kapil, don't have hope on the international community anymore, because let alone to take concerted measures, even to discuss Tigray at the UN, at the United Nations Security Council forum, to discuss it on an open forum. What it took is not the amount of crimes that were committed. What drove members of the UN Security Council to talk about Tigray in an open platform is not the number of harrowing war crimes that were reported to them. It's rather the very fact that today the Tigray Defense Forces forcefully defeated the Ethiopian National Army. That is when the UN Security Council even decided to talk about Tigray in an open platform. So it's the force of the Tigrayan people on the ground that is going to yield the will towards getting justice and reparation for the people of Tigray. Other than that, the international community will continue to play its proxy war over the people of Tigray, and in the midst of that, an entire population will be wiped out. So for anyone listening to this forum, particularly for Tigrayans, do support your Tigrayan forces on the ground. Make sure that your rights and responsibilities will be protected only when you are as strong as it can be. Otherwise, political actors across the board will continue to use you as a political bargaining chip. And in the midst of all, as I said, everyone will be exterminated. So do not lose hope, do not lose sight. Be cautious of the actions you're demanding from the international community, including the genocide determination, which, by the way, I don't think it's going to come anytime soon. But remember that the savers of this genocide are going to be the Tigrayan Defense Forces on the ground. And the other thing is we have to be realistic of our expectations. Realistic in a sense that if the American government is still more concerned about the Ethiopian sovereignty more than protecting people's human rights, that tells you that their commitment is not really with civilians, it's not with the people, it's rather with the Ethiopian state by itself. And another thing before I finish, I would like to mention is this concept of Pan-Africanism and how the Ethiopian government and its allies are trying to rally Africans behind them in their efforts to block any kind of meaningful action from the international community. For fellow Africans, Pan-Africanism is not really about states. It's not about protecting dictatorial, brutal, autocratic states. Pan-Africanism is about protecting African citizens. And this very narrative should not be used to justify the ongoing Tigray genocide. The concept of security has evolved beyond the state. Security involves the human security of citizens. And as such, any African that is concerned about Pan-Africanism and maintaining the integrity and unity of Africa as a continent should stand with the people of Tigray that are at the receiving end of a state-sponsored genocide that has lasted for over a year now. And very important to highlight that we're having this discussion at the backdrop of Tigrayans being encircled across Ethiopia and taken to concentration camps. Tigrayans are being deprived of their livelihoods, their jewelries, their financial income, mainly not only to deprive Tigrayans of this property, but also to systematically impoverish Tigrayans so that we'll never ever be able to come together, unite, and boom the economy at the same time, ignite ourselves as a nation. So these are some of the commentaries I have, but I once again would like to thank everybody for providing this much needed platform. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. That was a useful reminder of the reluctance of Western governments and so on not to break ranks with Abai and try. I don't know to what extent they still think they can prop him up or not, but that's been an ongoing theme over the past year. And it was a useful reminder of the irony of his being lauded as an advocate of gender equality while presiding over some of the worst mass rape atrocities of this century. And a very useful comment on the issues of what Pan-Africanism is actually about and should be about. Thank you for that, Miaza. And we're going to move, I'm going to hand back now to Chezi, who will moderate the final question and answer one. So I would like to, as I'll be bowing out now, I'd like to really thank all of the speakers and the commentators for their contributions so far. And I'll hand back to you now, Chezi.
Thank you, Fiona. We are all too quickly running out of time, but I'm pleased to ask Dr. Caroline Bennett to make a comment or ask a question to one of our panelists. So Dr. Caroline, please take the floor.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. This has been incredible to listen to, and I'm really privileged to be able to take part. I want to bounce off the back of Professor Kabila and just say, I mean, I agree with basically everything that you said, that you cannot rely on the international community. But what I want to add to that as a kind of call out to everybody that's listening here, and especially to Tigrayans, is that the reason for that is there is no such thing as the international community, right? That is a myth in itself. What exists are a network of individual states and organizations, each of which have individual interests. At the moment, what we have, unfortunately, is a huge amount of willful ignorance and willful blindness to what's been going on. And that's the facts on the ground that I think, Professor Kabila, that you said that that's what needs to change, are those are the things that need to change. And while it might be almost impossible to get a genocide determination, while it might be very difficult to get action, there are ways of getting individual states and your own nation to pay attention and potentially to take action. And I'm going to be completely crude, and the way that you do that with a government, and particularly with the British government, but I think with any government, is that you make it in their either economic interests or in their public interests to take action. And so what you need the government to do is to see a benefit for themselves of taking action. Now, that is horrific to actually think that that is the way to get action on humanitarian issues, on conflict issues, on human rights issues, but sadly it is the reality. But there are ways of doing that. And so I just want to leave with a kind of a few things to say is, you know, what needs to happen is you need to get people talking about it. You need to get politicians talking about it. You need to get media talking about it. It needs to be all over social media. It needs to be public, and it needs to be loud, and it needs to be constant, and it needs to become an annoyance. And you can see that things do change, and it is possible to get them changed. We saw it with the refugee crisis in 2015. The big change there was the photo of Alan Kurdi. It's horrific, horrific tragedy. But after that, we saw a change in Europe for a while. Unfortunately, we've seen a switch back, but there are ways of taking action. And so that's all I'm going to say, because I know that we are almost out of time. But with all of this information, you know, it can seem like there is no hope, but there is hope. It's just that we need to work on the individual state level and on the public level. And I think, you know, we can do that.
Thank you, Caroline. That was a very refreshing view and an important reminder of what we actually mean when we talk about international community as well. And I'll just now ask Mr. Andrew Robbins if he has any questions or would like to make a brief comment from the discussion we've had today. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Jessie, and thank you, everybody. Yeah, I think I'd like to make a few points and really respond perhaps best by picking up some of the things that Mukesh has commented on. I mean, I agree with so much of what he has said. Could I ask Mukesh a question? I've identified really that, one of the key things that's not discussed here is the sophisticated nature of the Tigrayan culture. And, it's my deep feeling that it's that sophisticated nature of that culture that is really the future of the culture. It doesn't appear to be from the outside a sophisticated culture, but it absolutely is. So with that, and against the sort of four main elements of a modern state, where you've got military, strategic, intelligence, and economic situations, how can you see the future of Tigray?
Mukesh, if you, yeah, please go ahead and answer.
My God, I mean, this is the $1 million question. Well, I think $1 million will be needed to answer that question. What I see the future of Tigray is that of an independent state. You heard me allude to that. Because I can't see how Tigrayans can survive in the current federation. Remember, Eritrea went off as well. Luckily, Ethiopian constitution allows that self-determination to take place. And also remember that all through history, states have formed, deformed, reformed, and come together in many configurations, both as unions, African Union, European Union, and also as independent. So I can't see any other future other than a safe place where Tigrayans can find safety. And that really does mean some kind of political dispensation, whether or not it's a state or a statelet, or whether it is, for all intents and purposes, a state, but is not necessarily fully independent, as some other countries might be, for some period of time. But I can't see a transition in Addis, for example. I can't see, for example, with all the blood that has been spilled and it's not just the amount of blood spilled, it's the way the blood is spilled that shapes the subsequent politics. It's not just how many people you kill. It's what the cruelties and tortures that happen along the way, including the mass rapes, that determines. I can't see what sort of transition in Addis Ababa would somehow find an accommodation. On one hand, between genocidaires, and on the other hand, between victims wanting to have their say, and then third parties who are accessories on either side, if you like to see. So I think if you're interested in saving lives and maximizing human dignity, then the sooner Tigrayans find their independent destiny, whatever political shape that takes, the better for humanity in that part of the Horn. And also, it will also stabilize the region as a whole. Because unless we do that, you're going to find internal displacement, external displacement, refugees, and so on. And Eritrea will remain restive. And of course, Somalia is already there, and Sudan now is imploding. So I see a strong, self-contained statelet or state as the most beneficial contribution out of this terrible war to try and stabilize the whole region.
Thank you, Mukesh. I think that was really well said. Andrew, did you want to add something there?
No, I just wanted to add, thank you. It was a good answer. And yeah, I would like to think that, we have, in a way, seen the sophisticated culture of Tigray, but not in its pure form, just seen it through the lens of all the kind of politics over the last 30 years within Ethiopia, etc. But to see it, manifest in its pure form within its own kind of geographical location, I think it's going to be very interesting, and hopefully, as Mukesh said, to the benefit of the whole region. So yeah, just one other thing I'd like to point out. Well, there are a few things that we didn't really discuss very much. The role of the media was touched upon, not covered too much. The other thing is, there's something that I've identified as what I call the genocide gambit. And this is something that states will function in this way. I think Caroline mentioned this. They're quite self-serving, and they will conduct a risk-benefit analysis on anything that they do, including genocide. So we have to, in terms of motivating and protecting ourselves, motivating these kind of psychotic states, and protecting ourselves, we have to really keep that in mind and think about how to play that balance between the risk and benefit and of the state. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. We are nearing the end of our webinar, but I just want, I see Evelina has her hand up, and I just wanted to ask if she had something final that you'd like to add. We just have a couple of minutes, if that's all right, if you want to make a final statement.
Sure, I will try to be quick. And I just wanted to respond also to what Professor Kapila mentioned, and that's in relation to the people's tribunals that were established here in the UK. And over the last 3 years, we've seen 3 different people's tribunals, so-called people's tribunals, that are independent investigations. One that was called China Tribunal for the organ harvesting in China, and that was particularly focused on the situation of the Falun Gong practitioners. Then, of course, there was one where we still await the judgment, and that's the Uyghur Tribunal. And then the newest one that was running its hearings only last week, and that's the Iran Tribunal. And of course, there are definitely benefits of running such tribunals. A lot of its effects will depend on the engagement with the media or civil society and what they are going to do with the information. But at least what we've seen with the China Tribunal, that there was not much engagement, for example, from the government or other actors after the judgment was pronounced. With the Uyghur Tribunal, we expect a little bit more involvement, especially from the media, from civil society. The government has been monitoring, but also we don't know whether the government will actually follow up on it at all. But in an event worth exploring, and the alternative would be definitely to have some kind of mechanism via the General Assembly or Human Rights Council, and a mechanism to collect and preserve the evidence of the atrocities, a mechanism to collect monitor the situation, as we've seen for Syria, as we've seen for Myanmar, as we've seen for many other countries, and of course including for Daesh atrocities most recently. So there are definitely options there, but at least from my perspective, I always believe that it's important to collect and preserve the evidence now if we want to see any kind of future, any kind of justice in the future. And also in relation to what Maisa said, in terms of we are not going to get the recognition of the atrocities as genocide anytime soon. And unfortunately, I do agree that we won't see it, and that's in the next months, maybe years. But also that's not unnecessarily differs from many other cases. For example, in the case of the Daesh atrocities, we've seen the first recognition of the atrocities as genocide first 2 years after the atrocities. The same with Myanmar, the same with China. So unfortunately, there is a massive delay from the atrocities and the formal recognition of the atrocities as genocide or other international crimes. So that goes back to what I was trying to say, that we need monitoring mechanisms that will monitor the situation, identify early warning signs, and will really focus on the serious risk of genocide rather than always having the atrocities happening and then 2 3 years later having some kind of recognition of the atrocities, because that's not the point. We're supposed to be preventing the atrocities. That's the duty under Article 1. So just few brief comments, and I will give the floor to others.
Thank you very much indeed. I see we have a couple more hands up, so if everyone is happy, we'll just keep going. But if you do need to leave, then we understand. Isaias, if you have something to add, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I think much has been said, but in general, first, I agree with the discussant about some of the topics raised. After many people died, international community interfering or taking action is useless. So I agree with Dr. Mukesh. I think we don't have to rely on the international community a lot, and justice delayed is justice denied, as you know. So I think I totally agree with that. And also the issue of holding criminals accountable doesn't have anything to do with lack of evidence. There's ample evidence. There's overwhelming evidence circulating over the internet and everywhere. So I think it has to be clear. I think so. My take is that I think we have to follow a mixed approach. We don't have to downplay the role of international community. I think we have to follow mixed approach. First, even starting investigation by international community or organizations can deter further atrocities. So, the holding the criminals accountable can take years, 10 or 20 years, but at least if a country or any international organization, including the UN, start investigating the atrocities, it can deter further violation, at least it can prevent, spoilage of evidence, and there will be a witness protection mechanism, and I think the country, the suspect country, will be deterred at least from committing further crimes. And I think we have to rely on that a little bit, and also we have to continue the diplomatic and legislative efforts throughout the world. And I think, as a result of the concerted effort of Tigrayans and Friends of Tigray, obviously the AGOA, the aid cut and travel ban, and also the negative image of the Ethiopian government as a genocide perpetrator country. So I think all this came after the collective effort, and I think we have to focus on that. We don't have to give up on the international community and its impact. And the most important is military upper hand, and I think I agree with that. So we have to have a military upper hand, and I think that can give a good leverage in terms of political bargain. So I think military victory is the most important aspect of the entire process. And that being said, I think there were some questions raised from other people, but I think in the interest of time, I'll stop it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isaias. Those were important points to raise. So thank you for that. Miaza, did you have something last that you wanted to add before we close?
Yeah, I just want to highlight how there is potentially going to be even a greater massacre of Tigrayans across Ethiopia, particularly in Addis. And this is evident by the fact that Tigrayans are being surrounded across the city. Those who are trying to protect Tigrayans are being massively intimidated by the government and vigilante groups from the city. At the same time, the Tigrayan Defense Forces and allied forces are approaching Addis. And mind you, these are forces that are feared and were made to be seen as villains by the community. So I urge everybody with consciousness across the international community to ring every bell available to them about a very increasing level of massacre that might be occurring in the coming days or even weeks across Ethiopia. And when I said that the international community is not really, they're not living up to their commitment, it doesn't mean I am in a way exonerating of their responsibility to protect or their responsibility to intervene and avert what could be our worst nightmare yet to come. But it's just to be realistic. Yes, we have to follow a mixed approach, but we have to be realistic and we have to manage our expectations so that we don't feel defeated every time we see the international community trying to create a false equivalence between those committing a state-sponsored genocide and those at the receiving end of it. That's all I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you. I think
that's 10 seconds, and I think there's one. Jesse, I apologize. So when I said military victory, I don't want to be misunderstood, and I think there's a very compelling reason why I say that. First, there's a responsibility to protect, right? The Ethiopian government failed to protect Tigrayans, so it's failed responsibility first, and invited a foreign country, Eritrea, and invaded Tigray and committed one of the most shocking crimes we've ever witnessed. Second, a third, so the social contract was breached. So every country is established based on social contract principle, right? So the federal government, by dismantling the constitutional order, it failed and it dismantled the constitutional order. So there's no law and order. So when the social contract is breached, Tigray, which was part of the union, the federation, it's just left alone, betrayed. So when you're betrayed, you can take arm. There's a legal and moral obligation to do that. So I think that's the reason why I'm supporting the military upper hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaias. And thank you to all of our speakers who have been with us today. This has been a really important and insightful seminar. And what I will take from this is how well I think we've managed to intersect these quite sometimes abstract to most people, these judicial process, these legal procedures, and actually the human cost of what those mean on the ground. And bringing those together has been something that I think we can all take away from this seminar. So I will just finish and say goodbye and thank you and hand over to Rowena and HYN, and a final note of thanks to the organisers for this session as well.
Thank you, Jessie. I'd like to say thank you to the moderators, speakers, discussants, and all participants, as well as our technical enabler, Rita Kasai. I'd like to invite you all to join us in next week, for next week at the same time for session 4 of the series of webinars. And the title of next week's webinar is Humanitarian Crisis and Socio-Economic Reconstruction in Tigray. Thank you, and I hope you can join us all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.